In the darkest hours of human history, when the world stood divided by fire and fury, there existed an army that moved in silence, spoke in codes, and won battles without ever firing a single shot. These warriors did not wear medals on their chests, and their names were not written in the glory books of war. They sat in hidden rooms, hunched over machines that clicked and hummed through endless nights, their fingers dancing across keys that held the power to save thousands of lives or doom entire nations. They were the invisible force behind every victory, the secret keepers of a war that consumed the entire planet, and they were women. While the world praised the soldiers on battlefields and the generals in their command rooms, these extraordinary women worked in the shadows, carrying secrets so dangerous that one whisper could change the course of history. Their story is one of courage that was never celebrated, sacrifice that was never acknowledged, and genius that was deliberately hidden from the world for decades. This is the entire story of women's role in wartime communication during World War II, a tale of brilliance concealed, voices silenced, and a contribution so massive that without it, the war might have ended very differently. Before the bombs began to fall and before the sirens wailed across European cities, women lived in a world that had already decided their limits. In the years leading up to World War II, society had drawn clear lines around what women could and could not do, what they could and could not become. They were daughters, wives, and mothers, confined to homes and expected to remain there. Education was available to some, but career opportunities remained severely restricted. The idea that a woman could handle complex mathematics, understand intricate machinery, or make critical decisions in moments of extreme pressure was considered laughable by many. Universities accepted women but often treated them as temporary visitors rather than serious scholars. Workplaces hired them for typing and filing, never for thinking or leading. This was the reality that shaped the early lives of countless young women who would eventually become the backbone of wartime communication. They grew up hearing that their brains were not built for logic, that their emotions would cloud their judgment, and that their proper place was anywhere except in positions of real responsibility. Yet within this suffocating environment, something remarkable was quietly growing. Young girls were proving themselves exceptional students in mathematics and languages, mastering subjects that supposedly belonged only to men, and developing skills that would soon become desperately necessary for national survival. The journey toward becoming invisible heroes began in classrooms where women were often unwelcome guests. In the early 20th century, prestigious universities slowly and reluctantly began opening their doors to female students, though many restrictions remained firmly in place. Women who wanted to study mathematics, engineering, or science faced professors who openly doubted their capabilities and classmates who saw them as oddities rather than equals. Despite these obstacles, determined young women pushed forward, driven by curiosity and intellectual hunger that refused to be suppressed. They attended lectures where they were sometimes the only woman in a room full of skeptical men. They solved complex equations and mastered foreign languages, proving repeatedly that intelligence had no gender. Many of these women came from families that valued education enough to support their unusual ambitions, though others had to fight even their own parents to continue learning. The skills they developed during these challenging years of education would prove invaluable when war arrived. Knowledge of German, French, Italian, and Japanese languages became critical assets. Understanding of mathematical patterns and logical systems became the foundation for code-breaking work. The ability to concentrate for long hours and maintain absolute accuracy under pressure became essential survival skills. These women did not know they were preparing for war, but their education, fought for and hard-won, was building the exact toolkit that would soon be desperately needed. As tensions rose across Europe and Asia during the late 1930s, governments began quietly reconsidering their attitudes toward women workers. The possibility of total war created a terrifying realization among military planners. There simply would not be enough men to do all the work that war required. If conflict came, millions of men would be sent to fight on battlefields, leaving massive gaps in factories, offices, and crucial support services. Initially, this realization came slowly and was met with resistance. Military establishments, traditionally conservative and male-dominated, struggled with the idea of women handling sensitive or important work. However, practicality began winning over prejudice as war became increasingly inevitable. In Britain, government officials started identifying which civilian jobs could be performed by women if necessary. In America, similar discussions took place, though with less urgency since the country was not yet directly threatened. These conversations happened quietly, in closed rooms, and rarely acknowledged the uncomfortable truth they revealed. Society had been wasting half its human potential all along. The women who would soon transform wartime communication were living ordinary lives during these tense months before war erupted. Some were finishing university degrees, others were working in schools or offices, and many were at home with their families. None of them could have imagined the extraordinary journey that was about to begin. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939 and Britain declared war, everything changed overnight. The immediate need for military expansion created instant labor shortages across every sector of society. Recruitment posters appeared on walls calling young men to enlist, and as they left their jobs and homes, the question became urgent and unavoidable. Who would fill the enormous vacuum they left behind? The answer came hesitantly at first, then, with increasing conviction, women would step forward. Government campaigns began encouraging women to contribute to the war effort, though initially these campaigns imagined women in traditional support roles like nursing or manufacturing. What few anticipated was how quickly women would prove themselves capable of far more complex and critical work. In the early months of war, military and intelligence services discovered they needed thousands of people to handle the explosion of communication work that modern warfare generated. Radio signals needed constant monitoring, messages required translation, codes demanded breaking, and military dispatches had to be encrypted and decrypted around the clock. The scale was unprecedented, and the shortage of qualified personnel became a crisis. Intelligence agencies began recruiting from universities, quietly approaching professors to identify their brightest students in mathematics and languages. Suddenly, young women who had been told their education was merely decorative found themselves receiving mysterious invitations to interviews in London or being asked to report to remote locations for work they were told almost nothing about. The call came to thousands of women, often in vague language that revealed little about what they would actually be doing, and it required them to make immediate, life-changing decisions. Women who answered the call found themselves traveling to locations they had never heard of, places that were not marked on maps, and whose very existence was classified as secret. In Britain, many arrived at Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion in the countryside that had been transformed into the nerve center of British code-breaking efforts. Others reported to communication stations scattered across the country, hidden facilities where radio signals were intercepted and analyzed. In America, women traveled to Arlington Hall in Virginia, where the Army's Signal Intelligence Service operated, or to secret Navy facilities where Japanese codes were being attacked. These locations appeared unremarkable from the outside, carefully disguised to avoid attracting attention. But inside, they housed some of the most important intellectual work of the entire war. When women first arrived at these places, many were shocked by what they encountered. They had expected, perhaps, to do clerical work or simple translation, but instead they found themselves facing complex mechanical devices, intricate cipher systems, and challenges that would test every bit of their intelligence and determination. The famous bomb machines at Bletchley Park, enormous electromechanical devices designed to break German Enigma codes, required operators who could understand their complex workings and troubleshoot problems under intense time pressure.
The women recruited to operate these machines received rapid training that assumed high intelligence and quick learning ability, and they rose to the challenge with remarkable speed. The women who entered wartime communication work quickly discovered that their new lives would be defined by secrecy more absolute than anything they had experienced. Before beginning work, every woman signed the Official Secrets Act in Britain or similar security oaths in other countries, legal documents that bound them to permanent silence about everything they would see and do. The consequences of breaking these oaths were made terrifyingly clear: prosecution, imprisonment, and the potential deaths of fellow service members whose safety depended on secrecy. This burden of silence became a heavy weight that these women would carry not just during the war, but for decades afterward. They could not tell their families where they worked or what they did. They could not share the stress and achievements of their days with friends. They could not even speak to colleagues about their work when they were outside the secure facilities. Many women developed cover stories, vague explanations about office work or administrative duties that satisfied curious relatives without revealing anything true. This enforced silence created a strange isolation, even as thousands of women worked together towards common goals. The work itself was far more intense and demanding than anyone had prepared them for. Women in code-breaking units stared at seemingly random letters for hours, searching for patterns that might unlock enemy messages. Those operating radio interception stations sat with headphones clamped over their ears through long night shifts, listening to enemy communications and transcribing everything with perfect accuracy. Translators worked through stacks of intercepted documents, and women operating cipher machines processed endless streams of outgoing Allied messages that needed protection from enemy codebreakers. The German Enigma machine was considered by its creators to be absolutely unbreakable, a cipher system so complex that it could generate millions of possible solutions for any single message. Breaking Enigma required not just brilliant mathematical theory, but also practical grinding work of testing possibilities and following tiny clues. Many of the women at Bletchley Park worked directly on Enigma decryption, operating the bombed machines that automated parts of the code-breaking process. These machines were not computers in the modern sense, but rather mechanical devices with rotating drums that simulated Enigma machine settings. Operating them required understanding both the theory of how Enigma worked and the practical reality of the machines themselves, which were temperamental and required constant adjustment. Women learned to recognize when a bomb was finding a potential solution, when it needed recalibration, and when it was experiencing mechanical problems that required immediate attention. This work was physically demanding as well as mentally exhausting. The machines were large and loud, filling rooms with clicking and humming sounds that continued day and night. The women who operated them worked in shifts around the clock because enemy messages had to be broken as quickly as possible to provide useful intelligence. Many women became extraordinarily skilled at this work, developing almost intuitive understanding of how the machines behaved and what different sounds and responses meant. Their contribution was absolutely critical because even the brilliant mathematical theories developed by code-breaking pioneers like Alan Turing were useless without skilled operators to implement them through the bombed machines.
While code breakers worked to unlock enemy messages, another group of women performed the essential task of intercepting those messages in the first place. Radio interception stations operated continuously, with women sitting at radio receivers wearing heavy headphones and turning dials to catch enemy transmissions. This work required extraordinary concentration and skill because radio signals could be weak, distorted by atmospheric conditions, or deliberately obscured by enemy efforts. The women who performed this work, often called intercept operators or wireless operators, developed remarkable abilities to distinguish between different types of signals and to transcribe Morse code at incredible speeds. Some became so skilled that they could recognize individual enemy radio operators by their unique sending styles, knowledge that helped Allied intelligence track the movements of enemy units. These women worked in buildings specifically designed for radio interception, with large antenna arrays outside and rows of radio receivers inside.
The work was isolating because operators needed silence to concentrate on the faint signals in their headphones, and shifts often ran through lonely night hours when radio propagation was best. Despite the monotony and physical discomfort of sitting motionless for hours with headphones pressing on their ears, these women maintained the vigilance that was absolutely essential. Every message they intercepted was potentially valuable intelligence, and missing even one transmission could mean missing information that might save lives or change battle outcomes. As the war progressed and the scale of communication intelligence work expanded massively, women did not merely support the system, they became the system itself. By the middle of the war, women made up approximately 75% of the workforce at Bletchley Park and similarly dominated American intelligence facilities. This was not because men were unavailable, but because women had proven themselves superior at many aspects of this work. Their attention to detail, their ability to maintain concentration during repetitive tasks, and their talent for pattern recognition made them ideally suited for code breaking and intelligence analysis. Women moved beyond operating machines and began contributing to the analytical and theoretical work of breaking codes. At Bletchley Park, women worked in specialized sections called huts, each focused on different types of enemy communications. Hut 6 handled German Army and Air Force Enigma messages, while Hut 8 tackled German Naval Enigma, which used more complex cipher settings. Women in these sections did not just process messages, but actively participated in solving cryptographic problems, developing new techniques, and training newcomers. Some women became section heads, managing teams and making critical decisions about how resources should be allocated. This level of responsibility was revolutionary in a society that had barely trusted women with voting rights just 2 decades earlier. The war against Japan presented different communication challenges that required different skills, and women proved equally essential in this arena. Japanese military codes were fundamentally different from German systems, based on complex systems that used code books, where numbers represented words or phrases, combined with additional cipher layers that scrambled the codes. Breaking these systems required people who could think in entirely different ways compared to breaking Enigma. Women working on Japanese codes at Arlington Hall and various Navy facilities demonstrated remarkable aptitude for this work. They built vast indexes of code groups, tracking which numbers appeared in which contexts, and slowly piecing together the meanings of thousands of code groups. This was painstaking work that required extraordinary patience and meticulous record-keeping, and women excelled at it. One of the most significant achievements in this area was the breaking of Japanese diplomatic codes, particularly the system the Americans called Purple. Understanding Japanese diplomatic communications provided crucial insights into Japanese strategy and intentions. Women worked on every aspect of this effort, from intercepting and transcribing the messages, to operating the machines that decrypted them, to translating the resulting Japanese text into English. The intelligence gained from these efforts contributed directly to American victories in the Pacific, helping commanders anticipate Japanese movements and allocate resources effectively. The women working in wartime communication lived under constant, crushing pressure that most people could never imagine. Every day brought new, urgent messages that might contain information about planned attacks, troop movements, or strategic decisions. The knowledge that failure to break a message in time could result in deaths of Allied soldiers or civilians created psychological stress that was overwhelming. Women worked shifts that often stretched beyond 12 hours, with breaks barely long enough to eat a quick meal. They returned to cramped quarters to sleep for a few hours before reporting back to work, and this cycle continued day after day, month after month, year after year. The mental exhaustion was compounded by the physical conditions of the work environments. Many facilities were poorly heated during winter and insufferably hot during summer. The machinery generated noise that became mentally draining over long hours. The necessity of absolute secrecy meant that women could not seek comfort or advice from outsiders, leaving them to cope with stress and trauma internally or only within the limited community of fellow workers. Despite these hardships, the women persisted with extraordinary dedication. They understood that their work mattered, even if they could not always see the direct results. They knew that somewhere decisions were being made based on the intelligence they helped produce, and that lives were being saved by their efforts. The intelligence produced by women in communication roles contributed to some of the most important Allied victories of the war, though the public knew nothing about this connection. The success of D-Day, the massive Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, depended heavily on maintaining the element of surprise. German commanders needed to be uncertain about where and when the invasion would occur. Intelligence from broken German codes revealed what the Germans believed about Allied intentions, allowing Allied commanders to reinforce German misconceptions through elaborate deception operations. Women at Bletchley Park and other facilities worked frantically in the weeks leading up to D-Day, processing enormous volumes of German communications to provide commanders with up-to-the-minute intelligence about German deployments and defensive preparations. When the invasion succeeded and Allied forces established a foothold in France, the contribution of these invisible women was absolutely crucial, yet none of them could ever claim credit or even acknowledge their participation. In the Pacific, intelligence about Japanese naval movements contributed directly to American victories at battles like Midway, where American forces ambushed a Japanese fleet that believed it held the element of surprise. Women who had intercepted and helped decrypt the messages that revealed Japanese plans could never tell anyone about their role in this turning point of the Pacific War. This pattern repeated throughout the conflict. Women contributed to victories large and small, yet remained invisible and silent. The demands of secret war work extracted heavy personal costs from the women who performed it. Many were young, in their late teens or early 20s when they were recruited, and they gave up what should have been the most free and exciting years of their lives. Romance and relationships became complicated by secrecy and constant work demands. Some women married colleagues who understood the work because they were the only people with whom any real connection was possible, while others put relationships on hold indefinitely. Family relationships strained under the burden of unexplained absences and inability to share experiences. Parents worried about daughters who disappeared to mysterious locations and could provide no meaningful information about their lives. Some families felt hurt or rejected by this enforced distance, not understanding that their daughters were bound by legal obligations that superseded family bonds. The psychological impact of constant secrecy, combined with the stress of the work itself and the isolation from normal social connections, created mental health challenges that women had to navigate largely alone. There were no counseling services, no recognition that the work might be traumatic, and no acceptable way to admit to struggling with the pressure. Women who broke under the strain were simply removed from their positions, often facing suspicion that they might have become security risks. Most women endured, finding strength in the sense of purpose that the work provided, and in the quiet bonds they formed with colleagues who shared their burden.
Perhaps the most painful aspect of the enforced silence was its impact on family relationships. Women returned to their families after years away, but they returned as strangers in many ways because they could not share the experiences that had shaped them. Parents asked what their daughters had done during the war and received only vague, unsatisfying answers. Husbands and wives kept secrets from each other that created invisible barriers in their marriages. Children grew up with mothers who had mysterious gaps in their personal histories, sensing that something important was being hidden but never understanding what. Some women lived their entire lives without ever telling their closest family members about their wartime work. They went to their graves carrying secrets that had defined their youth and shaped their entire lives, secrets that their children only discovered decades later when government files were finally declassified.
The psychological burden of this permanent secrecy was immense. These women had to live with the knowledge that their most significant achievements would never be acknowledged, that the pride they felt in their contributions could never be expressed, and that the world would never know who they really were or what they had accomplished. In the years and decades after World War II, societies built memorials and honored veterans, celebrated military achievements, and remembered sacrifices. The soldiers who fought received medals and parades. The generals who commanded became famous. The scientists who developed new weapons and technologies were acknowledged as heroes. But the women who had broken the unbreakable codes and intercepted the crucial messages remained invisible. Their contribution was not mentioned in history books, not included in war memorials, and not recognized in any public way. This was not accidental oversight, but deliberate policy. Governments considered the methods and successes of wartime communication intelligence to be secrets that needed protection even in peacetime. Revealing that Enigma had been broken, for example, would inform potential enemies that their supposedly secure cipher systems might be vulnerable. Therefore, the entire story remained classified, and the women who had lived it were forced to remain silent. Some women tried to find recognition in small ways, joining veterans organizations or attending reunions with former colleagues where they could at least acknowledge their service to each other. But these private acknowledgments could not compensate for the public invisibility. The world believed that men had won the war, while women had merely supported from the sidelines, and this fundamental misunderstanding of history became accepted truth. The silence stretched from years into decades. Women who had been young during the war grew middle-aged and then elderly, still carrying their secrets. The 1950s passed, then the 60s and 70s, and still the classification remained in force. During this long period, the women aged and their memories of the work began to fade naturally, details becoming fuzzy with time. Some died without ever seeing their contributions acknowledged. Others struggled with the feeling that the most important period of their lives had been erased from history. The secrecy also prevented historians from understanding World War II accurately. Books about the war were written and published without any mention of communication intelligence, or with only vague references that failed to capture its importance. The public understanding of how the war was won remained incomplete and distorted. Military victories were attributed to brilliant generals and brave soldiers, which was true, but not the whole truth. The intelligence that had guided strategic decisions and saved countless lives remained hidden. During these decades, occasional hints emerged that something important had happened in wartime communication work. A few carefully sanitized accounts were published with government approval, revealing tiny glimpses of the truth while maintaining official secrecy about most details. These hints tantalized former workers who knew the full story but still could not tell it. The breakthrough came gradually, beginning in the 1970s, when British and American governments began slowly declassifying some wartime intelligence records. The process was cautious and limited at first, with authorities releasing only carefully selected documents that they judged would not compromise current security. However, once the process began, pressure grew to reveal more of the truth. Former intelligence workers, now elderly, began advocating for the right to tell their stories before they died. Historians demanded access to records that were essential for understanding World War II accurately. The turning point came with the publication of books that revealed the Bletchley Park story to the public for the first time. These accounts shocked readers who had never imagined that British codebreakers had been reading German military communications throughout much of the war. The scale and importance of this intelligence success gradually became clear, and with it came the realization that thousands of people had worked on this project in complete secrecy. As more details emerged, the crucial role of women in this work began to be acknowledged. The bomb operators, the intercept operators, the translators, and the analysts were finally revealed as the backbone of the entire operation. Women who had maintained silence for 30 or 40 years finally received permission to speak about their experiences, and many did so eagerly, wanting to share their stories before it was too late. When the women of wartime communication were finally free to speak, their stories amazed listeners. They described the intensity of the work, the pressure they had endured, and the satisfaction they had felt at contributing to victory.
They revealed details about the machines they had operated and the techniques they had used. They talked about the camaraderie that had sustained them and the sacrifices they had made. Many expressed complex feelings about their experience. They were proud of what they had accomplished and grateful to finally receive recognition, but they were also angry about the decades of silence and the opportunities they had lost. They wondered how their lives might have been different if they had been allowed to build on their wartime achievements instead of being forced to hide them. Some expressed frustration that recognition came so late after many of their colleagues had already died. The stories revealed just how young many of these women had been when they took on enormous responsibilities. Some had only been 18 or 19 years old when they began working with systems that could affect the fate of nations. They described learning complex skills in a matter of weeks and then performing under pressure that would have broken many people. They remembered the fear of making mistakes that might cost lives and the exhaustion of working endless hours with no breaks.
As the full story of wartime communication intelligence became public, historians began reassessing the entire course of World War II. It became clear that many victories that had been attributed solely to military brilliance or technological superiority had actually depended critically on intelligence gained from broken codes. The Battle of the Atlantic, where Allied forces eventually defeated German submarines that had been devastating supply convoys, was won in large part because of intelligence about submarine positions and tactics. The campaigns in North Africa and Europe were guided by detailed knowledge of German plans and deployments. The Pacific War was shaped by American ability to read Japanese communications. None of these intelligence successes would have been possible without the thousands of women who did the grinding daily work of intercepting, decrypting, and analyzing enemy messages. Military leaders had made important decisions, but they had made them based on information provided by women whose names they often never knew. This realization forced a fundamental revision of how World War II was understood and taught. The women who had been invisible became recognized as essential participants whose contribution was equal in importance to any military campaign. Some received official honors decades after the war, with governments awarding medals and recognition to surviving veterans of communication intelligence work. These honors meant a great deal to the recipients, but could not fully compensate for the decades of silence and invisibility they had endured. The women who worked in wartime communication left a legacy that extended far beyond their immediate contribution to winning the war. They proved conclusively that women could handle complex intellectual work, master technology, and perform under pressure equal to any man. This proof came too late to benefit them directly, but it helped pave the way for future generations. The barriers that had limited women before the war never fully returned to their previous strength after the war ended, partly because the wartime experience had demonstrated women's capabilities so dramatically. The women of wartime communication also influenced the development of modern computing and cryptography. Many of the techniques developed during the war became foundations for post-war advances in these fields. Some of the women themselves contributed to these advances. After secrecy restrictions eased, several former Bletchley Park workers went on to careers in early computing, bringing the skills and knowledge they had gained during the war. The machines they had worked with, particularly the bombs and the more advanced Colossus computer used for breaking German teleprinter codes, represented important steps in the development of electronic computing. Women had been essential in operating and developing these machines, and their experience helped establish that computing was a field where women could excel. Even after decades of research and revelation, questions remain about the full extent and impact of women's contribution to wartime communication intelligence. Records were destroyed after the war, either deliberately to maintain secrecy or simply because their value was not recognized. Some women died before they could tell their stories, taking detailed knowledge of specific operations to their graves. The exact number of women who worked in communication intelligence across all Allied nations may never be known precisely. Researchers continue to discover new information as more records are declassified and as new accounts from former workers emerge. Each revelation adds detail to the picture, but also raises new questions about aspects of the work that remain unclear. There are also difficult questions about how to properly honor and remember this contribution. The women involved were part of military and intelligence services, but they were not combat soldiers in any traditional sense. They deserve recognition for their service and sacrifice, but the forms of recognition designed for traditional military service do not always fit their experience. Museums and memorials have been created at sites like Bletchley Park, preserving the physical locations where this work happened and telling the stories of the people who worked there. These sites serve as important reminders of a hidden chapter of history, but they cannot fully capture the experience of the thousands of women who worked in less famous locations or whose specific contributions remain unknown. The story of women in wartime communication during World War II teaches lessons that remain relevant generations later. It demonstrates the danger of underestimating human potential based on prejudice and preconceptions. The women who proved essential to Allied victory had been considered incapable of such work before the war created desperate need. Society had been wasting their talents and abilities, and only crisis forced a reassessment. This suggests how much potential continues to be wasted when people are excluded or discouraged based on characteristics unrelated to ability. The story also illustrates the complex relationship between secrecy and recognition. The secrecy that protected vital intelligence during and after the war also erased the contributions of thousands of people from historical memory. This erasure was particularly harmful to women because it reinforced existing prejudices about women's capabilities and contributions. Finding the right balance between necessary secrecy and proper recognition remains a challenge for intelligence services today. Additionally, the experience of these women reveals the psychological costs of secret service. They bore heavy burdens silently, without support or acknowledgement, and many carried trauma throughout their lives as a result. Modern understanding of mental health makes clear that such burdens require support systems and recognition, lessons that were learned too late to help the women of World War II, but that benefit those who serve in similar capacities today. The women who broke codes and intercepted messages during World War II were part of one of the most successful intelligence operations in history, yet they were hidden from the world for decades. They were recruited as young women, often barely out of school, and given responsibilities that would have terrified many people twice their age. They rose to the challenge with extraordinary courage and capability, mastering complex systems and working under intense pressure that never relented. They maintained perfect secrecy, even as that secrecy isolated them from everyone they loved and forced them to carry burdens alone that should have been shared. They contributed directly to saving countless lives and shortening a war that was consuming the world, yet they received no thanks and no recognition for decades. When they returned to civilian life, they were expected to forget everything and accept diminished roles in a society that still did not believe women were capable of the things they had just accomplished. They endured this injustice with remarkable dignity, waiting decades for the truth to finally emerge. When recognition finally came, it came too late for many, but was received with grace by those who lived to see it. These women changed history twice. First, they changed it by helping to win the most destructive war humanity had yet fought. Second, they changed it by proving that women could do anything men could do when given the opportunity, a lesson that slowly reshaped society even as its teachers remained invisible for so long. Their story is one of genius hidden, courage unacknowledged, and sacrifice unrecognized, but it is ultimately a story of truth emerging and justice, however delayed, finally arriving. The women who broke codes and intercepted messages during World War II were part of one of the most successful intelligence operations in history, yet they were hidden from the world for decades. They were recruited as young women, often barely out of school, and given responsibilities that would have terrified many people twice their age. They rose to the challenge with extraordinary courage and capability, mastering complex systems and working under intense pressure that never relented. They maintained perfect secrecy, even as that secrecy isolated them from everyone they loved and forced them to carry burdens alone that should have been shared.
They contributed directly to saving countless lives and shortening a war that was consuming the world, yet they received no thanks and no recognition for decades. When they returned to civilian life, they were expected to forget everything and accept diminished roles in a society that still did not believe women were capable of the things they had just accomplished. They endured this injustice with remarkable dignity, waiting decades for the truth to finally emerge. When recognition finally came, it came too late for many, but was received with grace by those who lived to see it. These women changed history twice. First, they changed it by helping to win the most destructive war humanity had yet fought. Second, they changed it by proving that women could do anything men could do when given the opportunity, a lesson that slowly reshaped society, even as its teachers remained invisible for so long. Their story is one of genius hidden, courage unacknowledged, and sacrifice unrecognized, but it is ultimately a story of truth emerging and justice, however delayed, finally arriving. The women who broke codes and intercepted messages during World War II were part of one of the most successful intelligence operations in history, yet they were hidden from the world for decades. They were recruited as young women, often barely out of school, and given responsibilities that would have terrified many people twice their age. They rose to the challenge with extraordinary courage and capability, mastering complex systems and working under intense pressure that never relented. They maintained perfect secrecy, even as that secrecy isolated them from everyone they loved and forced them to carry burdens alone that should have been shared. They contributed directly to saving countless lives and shortening a war that was consuming the world, yet they received no thanks and no recognition for decades. When they returned to civilian life, they were expected to forget everything and accept diminished roles in a society that still did not believe women were capable of the